Here's a guy who thinks the Shroud of Turin is real.
So a brand new study just dropped claiming that it finally debunks the Shroud of Turin, one of Christianity's most revered relics.
It's actually been debunked for about 700 years. One of the earliest mentions of the Shroud to appear in any historical documents is from 1389, when the Bishop of Troyes wrote a letter to Pope Clement VII warning him that the person responsible for the forgery had confessed to faking it. Carbon dating in 1988 corroborated the 14th century as being the time when the Shroud was made.
Brazilian 3D expert Cicero Moraes says that he can now prove that the Shroud never wrapped a real human body, let alone the body of Jesus Christ. Using state-of-the-art digital modeling, Moraes shows how the Shroud's strikingly clear image perfectly matches what you'd expect from a cloth draped over a flat sculpture, not a three-dimensional corpse. The internet has completely lit up, media headlines are super dramatic, as you might expect, and skeptics are now calling it game over. But as compelling as Moraes' findings seem, there is a huge problem here, a critical flaw in his analysis that most reports have completely missed.
No, there isn't.
Let's briefly catch you up on why the Shroud of Turin matters so much to so many people. The Shroud is widely believed to be the actual burial cloth of Jesus that wrapped the crucified body of Jesus Christ. It shows the hauntingly detailed image of a man bearing wounds exactly matching those described in the Gospels: pierced wrists, scourged back, wounds on the head from thorns, and even bloodstains consistent with Roman crucifixion.
The really weird thing about Christians' defense of this obvious hoax is that it isn't even consistent with the Bible's description of Jesus' burial cloth. The Gospel of John says that Jesus' head was wrapped in a separate cloth. Does the image on the shroud look like the head was wrapped in another cloth? You'd expect the hair and the beard to be more tightly pressed against the head. Instead, it looks like it's hanging pretty loose to me. Also, to me, it looks suspiciously like a medieval depiction of a person rather than an actual person.
For decades, researchers have been fascinated by this relic. It's not just Christians who are intrigued by this. Even skeptics admit that the Shroud is unlike anything we've ever seen in history. Its image isn't painted. There's no pigment, no dye, no ink. The image itself penetrates only the outermost surface fibers. It's incredibly superficial, thinner than a human hair. And perhaps most intriguingly, it actually encodes three-dimensional information, something completely unique in historical artifacts. In other words, it's not just an image, it's a kind of mysterious 3D photographic negative that no one has ever convincingly replicated, even with today's robust scientific technology. Recently, an X-ray scattering analysis from 2022 independently dated the Shroud's fabric back to around 2,000 years ago, placing it squarely in the time of Christ.
This X-ray study has some pretty glaring problems.
So as one might expect from the Daily Mail, this is just a sensationalistic misrepresentation of research, and specifically research published in this 2019 article and in this 2022 article, both of which were published in the open access journal Heritage. Now, these articles don't claim to have confirmed that the Shroud of Turin is 2,000 years old. What both of these articles claim is that if you apply an experimental method for dating old fabrics known as waxes, which is an initialism for wide-angle X-ray scattering, the results are consistent with a 2,000-year-old piece of fabric. Now, I'm not an expert in this. There are not many experts in this methodology because it is pretty new, it is experimental. So that raises an issue in and of itself. But there are a few other things to note. One, these articles both require that a certain calibration of both temperature and humidity be pretty consistent over multiple centuries for the results to actually indicate that the shroud is as old as they want it to be. Second, the majority of the authors of these two articles were also the authors of a 2017 article arguing that the blood on the shroud is consistent with someone who was tortured. That was subsequently retracted because there were significant criticisms of the findings, and the journal editors decided that the data did not support the conclusions of the article. So the majority of the authors on these two studies have a history of going beyond the data in trying to prove the authenticity of the shroud.
The shroud only dates to 2,000 years ago if you assume that it was kept in conditions that we know for sure it was not kept in.
Cicero Moraes, a Brazilian expert renowned for reconstructing historical faces in stunning detail, decided to digitally simulate exactly how a cloth, like the shroud, would drape over different objects, specifically a real human body versus a sort of shallow sculpture like a medieval bas-relief. First, Morales carefully built a digital 3D model of a human body matching the proportions of the figure in the shroud. A male, approximately 33 years old, thin, and around 5 feet 11 inches tall. That's actually exactly how tall I am. He then meticulously posed this digital figure to mirror the exact positioning of the shroud image, as you can see in this figure. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Moraes took a digital linen cloth, accurately sized, and ran a fabric dynamic simulation, basically letting gravity drop the virtual cloth onto this 3D body digitally. After mapping the contact points, he flattened the digital cloth to see what kind of image that it produced. The results? They were actually pretty striking, but maybe not what Shroud believers ever wanted to see.
Why, if the shroud created the image by being laid over it, would it only create an image of the front and the back, but not the sides? Why would the top of the head not create an image?
So is this truly the knockout blow that skeptics claim that it is? Before Shroud believers throw in the towel, there's an enormous problem that Moraes' research didn't address. Something so crucial, it might completely change how we interpret his results. Before we get to that fatal flaw, let's actually quickly cover what his critics are saying about this new research. Okay, almost immediately after Moraes' study dropped, scholars pointed out several key oversights. Russ Brolt, a Shroud lecturer and researcher, flatly said this, quote, "The work of Cicero Moraes offers no new information that we didn't already know before." And he's actually right about this. Okay, Shroud experts have known for decades that a simple cloth-to-body contact couldn't produce the image that we see on the shroud.
It's true that we've always had reason to believe it was fake, but Moraes demonstrated it in a way nobody's done before.
Moraes himself even acknowledged that he didn't address the microscopic or chemical characteristics of the image. He focused strictly on geometry and distortion. So here's why this matters. Okay, studies from the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, back in 1978, already demonstrated conclusively that there's no pigment, dye, or scorch marks causing the image. The image itself penetrates only the very outermost fibers, an impossible feat for medieval artists. Moreover, Sturp showed that the bloodstains came first, before the body image was formed. How could a medieval forger possibly accomplish that kind of precision?
If you look at sculptures of the time, I don't think you can credibly say that they lack precision.
And here's something even more significant that Moraes didn't consider, the so-called cloth collapse hypothesis, proposed by physicist Dr. John Jackson. Jackson theorized that a radiant burst of energy during the resurrection could have projected the body's image vertically onto the cloth without lateral distortion. So in other words, Moraes assumed that the image had to result from direct contact, which Shroud scientists have known for decades simply isn't the case.
So Jesus blasted God lasers directly forward out of the front of his face and backward out of the back of his head, but not out of the sides? This is the most ad hoc contrivance I've ever heard. Why would radiation start coming out of Jesus' body, and if it did, why would it only come out of the front and back but not the sides or the top of his head? This is an incredibly goofy rationalization. I know you think that this is the radiation his body gave off when he resurrected, but why would resurrection even involve radiation? And if it did, why would the radiation only shoot out of his body in two directions?
3D imaging expert Ray Downing, known for his Real Face of Jesus documentary, summarized it bluntly. Moraes used off-the-shelf 3D software to state the obvious and grab headlines, without addressing the deeper mysteries like the perfect encoding of subtle 3D data, no residual materials on the cloth, or how parts of the image formed without even touching the body.
It's almost as if it didn't, in fact, touch a body.
Having heard now from the critics, let's now turn to the critical flaw in Moraes' research. As compelling as Moraes' visuals might seem, his research overlooks one of the most puzzling and famous features of the Shroud, the digital negative phenomenon. Let's slow down for a second because, well, what exactly do we mean by digital negative? Well, when you snap a photo on an old school film camera, what you first see is a negative image, something like this. Notice how the lights and darks are actually reversed. Light areas look dark, dark areas look bright. Now, when you reverse these tones or invert these tones, the result is a positive image that your eye recognizes immediately.
Yeah, but that's not just the case with photographs, it's also the case when fingerprinting someone. The prints on your fingers aren't black like the ink used to capture them.
In 1898, the photographer Secundo Pia took the first ever photograph of the Shroud, expecting a sort of ordinary relic photo, but when he actually looked at the negative plate, He was stunned. Staring back at him wasn't this vague silhouette that he anticipated, but a very clear, lifelike portrait. Absolutely amazingly, the negative of the shroud became the positive portrait of the mysterious man that it depicted. It's like the shroud itself was already some kind of photographic negative. No one knows how. Something absolutely unheard of in the Middle Ages and extremely difficult to reproduce even today.
Since the image wasn't produced by ink or paint, I wouldn't be surprised if it were produced by heat. That would account for gradients.
But it gets even stranger. The shroud image doesn't just have like inverted tones, it actually encodes 3D distance information. When researchers digitally map the brightness of the shroud image onto height values, a clear three-dimensional representation of a human body emerges, like the iconic 3D rendering that you see here.
That 3D rendering looks exactly like a bas-relief sculpture. How do you not see that?
This means that the intensity of the shroud's image directly correlates to the distance between cloth and body, producing depth even in areas where the cloth never physically touched the body. And that's something no simple contact imprint or print-based forgery could ever achieve.
Given the lack of pigment on the shroud, it would make more sense that the image was baked on rather than printed on. This wouldn't necessarily create scorch marks.
Now let's circle back to Moraes' study. Okay, his method reduces the shroud's image down to a sort of binary scenario. Either the cloth touched the body or it didn't. Look again at his simulation images, okay? See how every point on his model is either red for contact or blue for no contact. This binary approach can't even begin to account for grayscale intensity variations, the very thing needed to produce the negative and its associated 3D effect. In other words, Moraes' study focuses entirely on geometric fit, how the cloth sort of drapes over an object, but it completely sidesteps the crucial question of how the image actually formed with its photographic characteristics. So here's the bottom line. All right, Moraes may have convincingly argued that a full body contact scenario doesn't fit the shroud. Fine. That idea was largely discarded decades ago. No one thinks that. He claims that a low relief bas relief fits better geometrically, but fitting an outline isn't remotely the same as reproducing the photographic negative effect.
Let's say the shroud was placed onto a bas relief and then baked. The heat from the bas relief would create gradients that look exactly like the 3D rendering you showed. The image would be strongest where the cloth is touching the sculpture and lighter in the parts that are a few millimeters away.
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.